Good evening, all, and welcome. Tonight, I have a chilling collection of haunted house stories for you to enjoy. So settle in, get comfortable, and let the darkness take its quiet hold. It stood at the end of a narrow lane, framed by overgrown trees that swayed like watchers in the wind. The locals called it the Hollis House, though few remembered who the Hollises were anymore. The shutters were always closed, even in daylight, and the paint peeled in long, curling strips, like the house itself was trying to shed its own skin. When Emma and David first saw it, they thought it was perfect, old. Yes, but beautiful in that kind of forgotten way that makes you want to bring something back to life. They were newly married, still caught in that hopeful glow where everything feels possible. The real estate agent hesitated when they asked about the place, mumbling something about previous incidents. But the price was too good to ignore, so they bought it. And on a soft September afternoon, with the smell of rain still hanging in the air, they moved in. At first, the house seemed almost shy, quiet, still, filled with the faint scent of dust and old cedar. Each step on the wooden floorboards echoed a little too long, as though someone or something was listening. But Emma told herself it was imagination. Old houses creak, air moves through walls, shadows stretch when they're not supposed to. The first week passed peacefully enough. They unpacked boxes, painted the kitchen, laughed about how the lights flickered whenever they used the toaster. But then came the nights. It started with sounds, soft, hesitant, like someone walking slowly down the upstairs hall. David blamed the pipes, but Emma knew the rhythm of footsteps when she heard them. Sometimes she'd wake in the early hours and feel the mattress dip slightly, as though someone had sat down beside her. She'd turn, expecting David, but he'd be fast asleep facing the wall. Then the piano began to play. It stood in the parlor, an old upright with keys yellowed by time. Neither of them could play, and they'd never even opened it since moving in. Yet one night, just after 2 in the morning, a single note rang out, soft, low, and trembling. Then another, and another. The melody was simple, almost childlike, but filled with something that felt wrong. A sadness that didn't belong to them. Emma crept down the stairs, heart pounding so loudly she could barely hear. The piano sat in the faint moonlight spilling through the curtains. No one was there. The air smelled faintly of roses and dust. The keys were still vibrating. The next morning, she told David. He smiled, trying to hide his unease. "Probably the wood expanding," he said. "Temperature changes, you know." But when she lifted the piano lid, she found something inside. A single wilted flower, pressed flat between the strings. A lilac. From that night on, the piano never stayed quiet for long. The notes came softly, like breathing. Sometimes it stopped the moment she entered the room. Other times it didn't stop at all, and then came the whispers. They were faint at first, almost part of the wind, until she realized they were coming from inside the walls. Muffled voices, as though someone were speaking just beyond the plaster. She'd press her ear against it and catch fragments. "Don't let her go." Or, "It's too late now." David tried to laugh it off, but his eyes began to change. He stopped sleeping in the upstairs bedroom. He said the dreams were too vivid. A woman standing at the foot of the bed, humming the same tune as the piano, her face pale, her hands clasped around a lilac. By the end of the second month, Emma started leaving the lights on at night. It didn't help. The house had learned their names. Sometimes, when the wind howled through the trees, she could swear she heard it whisper, "Emma!" And so the love that had brought them there began to fade, replaced by silence, suspicion, and a growing sense that the house had been waiting all along. The days grew colder, and the light in the house seemed to thin out, as though the sun itself no longer trusted the windows. Emma began to notice small things. Doors she knew she'd closed left slightly ajar. Photographs tilted on the walls. A faint humming that seemed to drift through the vents when the air stood still. David tried to ignore it all. He buried himself in work, leaving earlier, coming home later. But every night his eyes carried the same shadowed look, as if he'd seen something he couldn't explain but refused to say aloud. One evening, Emma found him sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a spot on the wall. "What is it?" she asked softly. He didn't answer right away. Then he said almost to himself, "There's writing under the wallpaper." He peeled a small strip back, and there it was, faint. Jagged words scrawled in pencil. She never left. Neither of them spoke after that. They simply stared at the message until the sound of the piano drifted through the hall again, playing that same trembling melody. That night, Emma dreamt of water. Dark, still water filling the parlor. The piano half submerged, keys glinting beneath the surface like teeth. A woman floated just above them, her eyes open, her hands folded around a bunch of lilacs. She woke, gasping, her pillow damp with tears she didn't remember shedding. In the morning, she decided she needed answers. So she drove into town to the small county archive near the square. The clerk, a gray-haired man with kind eyes, searched through brittle records until he found an old newspaper clipping from 1948. Local woman drowns in home well. Tragic accident at Hollis residence. The article said her name was Margaret Hollis, a young pianist who had lived alone after her husband's passing. She was found in the well behind the house, clutching a bouquet of lilacs. They called it suicide, though neighbors insisted they'd heard arguing and music the night before. When Emma returned home, the house felt different. The air was thicker, heavier. As she passed the piano, she noticed the lid was open. Inside lay another lilac, fresher than before. That evening the whispers began again, but now they had shape, a woman's voice, gentle but trembling, echoing faintly from the upstairs hall. Emma followed the sound to the guest room, the only one they never used. The door creaked open on its own, revealing a mirror standing in the corner. The glass was fogged, though the air was dry, and in that fog, for the briefest moment, she saw a reflection that wasn't her own. A pale face, dark eyes, hair dripping as though just pulled from water. Emma stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. The reflection smiled. When she blinked, it was gone. David didn't believe her. He said grief, stress, imagination, anything to explain it away. But later that night, he found the same writing on the wall behind their bed. Different words this time. You shouldn't have come. The next morning, every lilac in the garden had bloomed overnight. Dozens of them, swaying in a wind that hadn't yet started to blow, and from somewhere deep within the walls, the faint sound of a woman humming carried through the air. The same lullaby Emma had been hearing in her dreams. By the third month, the Hollis house no longer felt like a home. It breathed in its own quiet way, inhaling with the settling of the floorboards, exhaling through the sighs that slipped from the vents. Emma had stopped opening the curtains. She said the outside world felt too loud now, too bright, as though the house didn't want her to leave. David, meanwhile, had grown distant. He rarely looked at her when he spoke. Sometimes he'd pause mid-sentence, tilting his head slightly, as if listening to something she couldn't hear. When she asked what it was, he'd frown and say, "Nothing." But there was always a tremor in his voice, a thin thread of fear he couldn't disguise. One evening, Emma found him standing in the parlor, staring at the piano again. The keys were moving on their own, slow, deliberate, playing that same mournful tune. The air around the instrument shimmered faintly, like heat rising from the pavement, even though the room was cold enough to see their breath. She whispered, "David, stop it." He didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the keys. When she touched his shoulder, he flinched hard, then turned to her with a look that wasn't entirely his. His pupils were wide, his skin pale. And in a voice that trembled like the music itself, he said, "She's not gone, Emma. She's been here all along. She just wants someone to remember." That night, David dreamt of the woman. He saw her standing by the well behind the house, lilacs floating on the water's surface, her face reflected in the ripples. She reached out to him, her lips moving, but the words were lost beneath the sound of rushing wind. When he woke, the window beside the bed was open, and the scent of lilacs drifted through the cold air. The next morning, Emma found muddy footprints leading from the back door to the parlor. They were small, not David's, and they ended right at the piano bench. The seat was damp, as though someone had been sitting there in soaked clothes. She tried to clean it, but when she wiped the water away, the imprint of a hand appeared on the lid. A woman's hand, slender, delicate, pressing against the wood from the inside. Emma screamed. David came running, saw it, and for the first time, he didn't try to explain it away. He just stared, frozen, as the handprint slowly faded. That night, he refused to sleep upstairs. They stayed in the living room, wrapped in blankets, every light on. Around midnight, a soft melody began to drift through the air again. But this time it wasn't coming from the piano. It was coming from the walls. The tune rose and fell like breathing, a lullaby, old and cracked with sorrow. Emma covered her ears, trembling. David whispered, "She's in the house." And then for the first time, the voice spoke clearly, gentle, almost kind, but echoing from everywhere at once. "Not in the house," it said. "I am the house." The lights flickered. The air thickened. Somewhere above them, a door slammed shut with such force the glass panes rattled. The house groaned, beams creaking, the walls trembling as if alive. Then silence. The kind of silence that feels like it's listening back. David whispered, "We need to leave." But when he turned toward the door, the knob was already turning, slowly, on its own. And from the darkness beyond, a faint scent of lilacs drifted in. The storm rolled in just after midnight. Wind clawed at the shutters, rain lashed the windows, and thunder shook the floor beneath their feet. Emma and David sat in the living room, pale and sleepless. The glow of a single lamp painting trembling shadows across the walls. The piano played again. Not a tune this time, but single, uneven notes, like fingertips testing the keys after a long sleep. David stood up. "She wants to be heard," he said quietly. His voice sounded far away as though it belonged to someone else. Emma grabbed his arm. "Don't," she whispered. But he was already walking toward the parlor. The house seemed to hold its breath. The wind outside fell still. The sound of the piano grew louder. Emma followed him, her heartbeat echoing in her ears. The parlor door was open, the light flickering. The piano lid had lifted itself. The keys pressed down in slow rhythm, playing a song that felt like grief given shape. And standing behind it was the woman. Her dress was soaked, her hair clung to her face, and her eyes were endless, black and glistening, as though filled with the same water that had taken her life. Lilacs hung from her hands, dripping petals across the floor. Emma froze. David took a trembling step forward. "Margaret," he whispered. The name came naturally, as if he'd always known it. The woman turned toward him. Her lips moved, and the whisper filled the air again, not from her mouth, but from the walls, the floor, the very air around them. "Stay." David's expression softened, like someone seeing a long-lost friend. Emma shouted his name, but he didn't move. The woman reached out, and for a moment, their hands almost touched. Then the piano slammed shut with a deafening crack. The lamp shattered. The room plunged into darkness. When Emma opened her eyes, the storm had gone silent. The air smelled of wet earth and lilacs. David was gone. She called for him, her voice breaking against the silence. She searched every room, every hallway. The upstairs windows had blown open. The curtains fluttered like pale hands waving her away. Finally, she stepped outside into the cold dawn. The rain had stopped and mist hung low over the yard. She followed the muddy trail toward the well. The lid was open, and floating on the surface, half crushed and soaked, was a single lilac. Emma fell to her knees. The wind rose again, whispering through the trees. A soft voice, sorrowful, familiar. "Thank you," it said. "He's home now." Days later, when the police came, they found no sign of David, no footprints beyond the well, no evidence of struggle. Just the piano, still wet from the rain, and on its keys, pressed into the dust, the faint outline of two hands side by side. Emma left Willow Lane before winter came. The house still stands, its shutters drawn, its gate half broken. Locals say if you pass by at night, you can hear faint music through the trees. A piano playing softly, followed by the sound of a man's laughter fading into silence. And sometimes, when the wind shifts, the scent of lilacs drifts across the lane, lingering just long enough for you to wonder if someone's still inside, waiting for company. The sea has a memory all its own. It keeps every whisper, every lost word, every final breath that ever fell beneath its waves. And on the farthest edge of Maine's rocky coast, where the wind speaks louder than people do, there stands a lighthouse that remembers more than it should. The locals call it Gray Point Light. It hasn't been manned in nearly 50 years, not since the keeper vanished, one winter night without, leaving so much as a footprint in the snow. The government sealed it off, declared it unsafe, and let it fade into legend. But on some nights, when the fog rolls in thick from the Atlantic, sailors swear they still see its beam cutting through the mist. Steady, patient, as if someone up there never stopped watching. When Thomas arrived that autumn, he didn't believe in legends. He was a historian, practical and careful, drawn to facts rather than fears. The lighthouse had been his obsession for years. He wanted to write its story, uncover the truth about the missing keeper, and perhaps bring reason to the superstition that clung to the place. He rented a small cabin near the cliffs and began visiting the tower each day. The climb up the winding stairs was long, the air heavy with salt and rust. Each step echoed up the narrow spiral like a memory refusing to fade. The light at the top no longer worked, but Thomas liked it that way. The silence, the sea, the height. It all made him feel small in a comforting way. At night, he'd sit outside the cabin, notebook in hand, listening to the waves crash below. The sound was endless, steady, rhythmic, like breathing. And yet sometimes between those waves, he could swear he heard something else, a faint voice carried by the wind. A man's voice, rough but calm, murmuring words he couldn't quite catch. He told himself it was the sea, that it plays tricks on you if you listen too long. But the next night, the same thing came again, and this time, it called his name. Thomas! He froze. The voice was soft, close, almost behind him. But when he turned, there was no one there. Just the endless stretch of dark ocean, the distant crash of water against rock, and the old lighthouse standing silent against the night sky. He went inside, lit the lantern, and tried to write. His hands shook slightly, but he forced himself to focus. He told himself it was only wind through the cliffs, nothing more. Yet as he wrote the keeper's name, Elias Ward, 1912-1969, the lantern flickered. The page trembled, and a drop of water fell onto the paper, though the ceiling above was dry. When he looked up, the air smelled faintly of salt and iron, and somewhere above him, deep within the tower, came the sound of footsteps. Thomas stared up into the hollow spine of the tower, heart hammering in rhythm with the waves below. The footsteps were slow, steady, deliberate, each one echoing through the stone like the heartbeat of the place itself. He called out, "Hello?" His voice bounced back, thinner, fainter. Only the sea answered. Lantern in hand, he began the climb. The spiral staircase wound tightly upward, iron steps slick with age. His breath came quick, visible in the chill. With every step, the sound above him seemed to move just one flight higher, always keeping its distance. Halfway up, he paused to rest. The walls were slick with condensation, though outside the air was dry. He touched the bricks. They were cold but pulsing faintly, as though the lighthouse still lived. When he reached the top, he found the glass chamber exactly as it should have been. Broken panes, rusted machinery, a hollow metal shell where the great lens once turned. Yet there, in the center of the platform, a faint blue light shimmered, no larger than a candle flame. It pulsed slowly, like breathing. Thomas moved closer, every instinct torn between awe and fear. The air around it hummed, a low, constant vibration that made his skin prickle. When he reached out, the light flickered, and in that flicker he saw a man standing just beyond it. The figure was tall, draped in a weathered coat that still dripped seawater. His beard was white with salt. His eyes, pale and tired, caught the lantern glow like wet glass. Thomas froze. You're not real," he whispered. The man's mouth curved slightly, not into a smile, but something sadder. "I kept the light burning," he said, voice low and rough like the ocean's edge. "Even when no one came." Thomas stepped back. "Elias Ward?" The figure nodded once. "The sea doesn't forget its own," he murmured. "And neither do the drowned." Before Thomas could move, a gust of wind tore through the tower. The blue light flared, blinding him. When it faded, the figure was gone. But the light was stronger now, casting long, ghostly beams through the shattered glass into the fog beyond. Outside, far below, the waves had gone quiet. The entire coast seemed to be holding its breath. Then came the sound, faint at first, like a whistle carried by the wind. Then clearer, louder, a ship's bell. Thomas stumbled to the railing. Through the fog, he saw something moving on the water, the silhouette of a vessel drifting toward the rocks. It shouldn't have been possible. There hadn't been a working ship route there for decades. The bell rang again, followed by the hollow echo of voices calling through the mist. "Light the way," one whispered. "Guide us home," said another. Thomas gripped the railing. "Elias!" He shouted into the fog. "What do you want from me?" The voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once. The air, the sea, the tower itself. "Finish what I began." The blue light surged, flooding the room in cold brilliance. Thomas shielded his eyes, and when the light dimmed again, the ocean was empty. No ship, no bell, just waves breaking gently against the rocks. He turned toward the stairs, breath shaking. But before he descended, he noticed something carved into the metal frame of the lantern housing. A line scratched deep, weathered by salt and time, for those who never reached the shore. The next morning, the storm had passed, but the sea remained restless, its gray surface folding and breaking like a creature turning in its sleep. Thomas hadn't slept. The blue light still burned faintly at the top of the lighthouse, even though no oil fed it, no flame sustained it. Every few minutes it pulsed, slow, rhythmic, like a heartbeat waiting to be answered. He needed to know what lay beneath those waves. By noon, the tide had fallen enough to expose the rocks below the cliff path. Thomas climbed carefully, gripping the rope he'd brought, boots slipping on slick stone. Seagulls circled above, shrieking as if warning him back. When he reached the base, he saw it, the curve of a wooden hull half buried in black sand. A shipwreck, old but unmistakable. The name still faintly carved into the rotting wood. The Meridian. He froze. That was the ship Elias Ward had commanded, the one that vanished in 1883. Thomas stepped closer, water lapping at his knees. The wreck leaned against the rocks like a corpse at rest. Pieces of the deck were scattered across the shore, half-eaten by seaweed and rust. Inside the main cabin, everything was preserved by salt. A brass compass, an overturned lantern, and a thick logbook sealed in a cracked glass case. He pried it open, coughing at the smell of rot and brine. The first page was blurred beyond reading, but the last entry stood out clearly, the ink black as if written yesterday. "The storm won't let us go. The light above us burns, though no one tends it. I swear by the sea it calls our names." Thomas shut the book, hands trembling. Behind him, the tide began to rise faster than it should have, waves slamming against the rocks in sudden fury. He turned toward the cliff and saw them. Shapes, pale and shifting beneath the surface. Not fish, not shadows, faces. Men in tattered coats, eyes open wide, mouths moving silently beneath the water. One reached up, hand skeletal, dripping, but unmistakably human. Thomas stumbled backward, slipping on the slick stones. "No, no!" The sea roared back. A single voice rose above the surf, familiar, commanding. "Light the way, Thomas." Elias Ward's voice. Thomas spun toward the cliff. The lighthouse stood above, its faint blue beam cutting through the daylight like a ghost's lantern. It wasn't flickering now. It was steady, alive. He scrambled up the rocks, panting, not daring to look back until he reached the top. When he finally turned, the wreck was gone. Nothing but calm water remained. But the rope he had used to climb. It was wet, as if something had held it from below. That night, as darkness swallowed the coast again, the blue light burned brighter than ever. From his window, Thomas could see its glow stretch miles into the fog. And just before midnight, from somewhere out at sea, came the sound of a single distant bell. By the time the next evening fell, the fog was already moving in again, thick, colorless, and endless. Thomas sat at his desk in the keeper's quarters. The old ship's log spread open before him. He'd read the final line a dozen times, tracing the words with his fingers until the ink seemed to breathe. Outside, the blue light pulsed, through the mist, like the slow inhale and exhale of a sleeping beast. Each flicker filled the room with a faint hum that vibrated in his bones. He couldn't ignore it anymore. The light wanted something. He took the lantern and descended the spiral stairs, past the storeroom down into the cold. At the base of the tower, beneath a loose panel in the floorboards, he found a small iron latch. It shouldn't have been there, but it was, and it looked ancient. When he pulled it open, the hinges screamed. A smell rose up from below, damp earth and something metallic like rust or blood. He climbed down the narrow stone steps, his lantern barely reaching the walls. The deeper he went, the colder the air grew until he could see his breath. Then at the bottom, the passage opened into a circular chamber carved directly into the rock. The walls were covered in marks, spirals, runes, and names scratched in jagged hand. At the center stood a stone pedestal, and resting on it was another logbook, not one from the Meridian. This one was stamped with the lighthouse's seal. He opened it, and the first page read, "For whoever keeps the light after me." The handwriting was neat, deliberate. He recognized it instantly. It was Elias Ward's. Thomas's eyes raced across the pages. The entries told a story of how Ward had once been shipwrecked himself, saved by the strange blue glow that appeared during the storm. How he'd followed that light to the cliffs and built the lighthouse around it. How he'd sworn to feed it, to keep it burning no matter the cost. "The light protects us," one entry said, "but it hungers. It remembers the drowned. If ever it goes dark, they will return." Thomas's breath caught. The light wasn't guiding ships. It was keeping something contained. Suddenly the lantern dimmed. The air grew heavy, vibrating with the same deep hum he'd heard before. The marks on the walls began to shimmer faintly blue as if waking up. Then, footsteps, slow, wet, dragging across the stones behind him. He turned, lantern shaking. A shape stood at the edge of the darkness, tall, draped in a tattered coat that dripped seawater onto the floor. Its face was hidden beneath shadow, but the voice that came from it froze his blood. "You lit the way, Thomas." It was Elias Ward. His eyes were hollow, glowing faintly with that same blue fire. Thomas stumbled backward. "You're dead!" Ward smiled faintly. "The sea doesn't keep its dead. It trades them." He stepped closer, his boots leaving no sound. "The light needs a keeper, always. Someone to watch. Someone to feed it." Thomas shook his head, stepping away. No, I'm leaving. "I won't." But the chamber began to rumble, the stone underfoot cracking as a low moan rolled through the air. From the walls, hands began to emerge, ghostly, pale, dripping. They reached toward him, not to grab, but to offer. Ward's voice echoed. "Every keeper must give the sea a name." The walls pulsed with light. The blue glow poured through the cracks like water, rising around Thomas's boots. He shouted, "What do you want from me?" The voice that answered wasn't Ward's anymore. It was a chorus, hundreds of drowned voices whispering as one. "Remember us." The lantern went out, and above, far above, the lighthouse beam burst into a steady, blinding blue that lit the entire coastline. By morning, the lightkeeper's cottage was empty. Only the logbook remained, open to a fresh page. Written in new ink, a final note read, "The light still burns. The sea is quiet." For now, night settled over Gray Point like a velvet curtain, soft and endless. The waves whispered to the cliffs below, gentle now, but with a weight that hinted at storms yet to come. Thomas stood on the edge of the tower platform, looking down at the restless ocean, lantern in hand, heart still thrumming from what he had discovered in the secret chamber. The lighthouse pulsed faintly behind him, the blue light flowing steadily, keeping vigil over the coast. He could feel it in his bones. The energy of 100 lives intertwined, of sailors lost and found, of a keeper who had never truly left. Every beat of the light seemed to echo the breathing of the sea itself. Thomas climbed the spiral stairs slowly, each step a whisper against the cold metal. He paused often, listening to the rhythm of the waves, the distant cries of gulls, and the faint hum of the lighthouse. It was a sound both comforting and terrible, a lullaby from the deep. At the top, he placed the lantern beside the controls. The blue glow flooded the chamber, illuminating the peeling paint and rusted iron with a ghostly brilliance. Thomas touched the edge of the light mechanism, feeling the cold hum through his fingertips. He understood now. The lighthouse was more than stone and glass. It was a memory, a guardian, a vessel for the lives it had kept. Outside, fog swirled thick and slow, curling around the tower like pale fingers. Thomas leaned against the railing, letting the mist kiss his face. He could see shadows moving within it, faint forms that seemed almost human. He realized these were the lost souls drawn by the light, held in its gentle glow. They were waiting, not to harm, but to be remembered. A soft sound caught his attention. Not the sea, not the wind, but a single note of a piano, carried faintly across the mist from somewhere far below. It was the same melody he had heard at Willow Lane, altered by distance and time, but unmistakable. A lullaby meant for the lost, for the souls who never reached home. Thomas closed his eyes and whispered their names. Every sailor, every voice, every life that had passed beneath the cliffs and the waves. He felt the light pulse faster, warmer, acknowledging him, welcoming him into a rhythm older than himself. Time seemed to slow. The fog thickened, wrapping the tower in a quiet embrace. He could hear the distant sound of bells, each one tolling gently as if counting the lives it had watched over. The sea below reflected the light in long, shimmering trails, endless and serene. Thomas realized then that some guardians are not chosen. They are called. The light had called him, as it had called every keeper before him, to tend, to witness, to remember, and in that calling there was peace. The piano melody grew softer, fading into the hum of the sea. The shadows in the fog shimmered briefly, then melted into the darkness. Thomas exhaled slowly, letting the tension leave his shoulders. He was no longer afraid. He was part of the light now, a quiet witness to the endless dance of waves and souls. The night stretched on, gentle and unbroken. The lighthouse shone, unwavering, a beacon not just of guidance but of remembrance, and somewhere far below the echoes of lives long gone mingled with the wind, a soft chorus that hummed in harmony with the sea. And so Thomas stood, watching, listening, remembering. The keeper and the light, together, guarding the secrets of the deep, and the lullaby of the lost carrying softly into the night. The inn stood quietly on a corner, where the cobblestones had forgotten the feet that once hurried along them. Its windows were tall and narrow, casting long shadows on the street as the evening sun dipped low. The locals whispered about the building in hushed tones. They called it the Widow's Inn, though no widow had lived there in decades. Yet room 7, the master bedroom, seemed to remember her, keeping the chill of grief pressed into the walls like a faint perfume. When Claire arrived, she was charmed by its old-world elegance. The dark wood floors creaked pleasantly beneath her feet, and the high ceilings gave her the sense of floating slightly above the room itself. But the air in room 7 was different. It smelled faintly of lilacs, pressed and old, and she felt a subtle weight as she unpacked her things, a quiet insistence that someone else had once been there. The first night passed uneventfully. Claire read by lamplight, listening to the muffled sound of horses on the distant streets. But just before sleep she noticed it. The mirror on the far wall fogged lightly, though the room was dry. A shadow moved behind the glass, thin and trembling. She blinked, and it was gone. The next morning, she noticed small signs, a handprint, pressed faintly, into the dust on the windowsill, a chair slightly angled from where she'd left it, and the faintest whisper as she entered the bathroom. "Don't leave me." She told herself it was imagination. Old inns make noises, mirrors fog, memories linger. But over the next few nights, the whispers grew more distinct. She began to hear footsteps pacing the room slowly, methodically, almost as if the house itself were walking beside her. The mirror reflected her alone, but sometimes, just at the corner of her eye, she glimpsed a pale figure, a woman, wearing black, her face pressed tight with sorrow. On the third night, Claire woke to the sound of soft crying. She followed it toward the mirror. There, in the reflection, the woman stood at the edge of the room. Claire froze. Her breath came in short, shallow bursts. The woman's lips moved, forming words Claire could not hear. And then she disappeared. From that moment, the room seemed alive with a presence. Claire noticed the lilac scent would appear at irregular times, never lingering too long, always hinting at memory, mourning, and time's relentless passage. She began writing in a journal, as if documenting the faint echoes would give her the courage to sleep. Yet every night when the lights dimmed, the whispers returned, soft, sorrowful, and persistent, a lullaby for a presence that could never rest. Claire learned to listen, and slowly the shadows stopped frightening her. She began to speak to the woman in black, softly, apologetically, learning that some spirits only need to be remembered to ease their sorrow. The innkeeper, watching from the corridor, said nothing. He had seen countless guests come and go, but room 7 always held its secrets. He only knew this: if you listened, you could hear the widow's lullaby, drifting lightly through the walls, touching the edges of your dreams without ever letting you fully forget. The school had stood abandoned for decades, a monument to forgotten voices and vanished laughter. Snow and wind battered its slate roof, and ivy climbed like slow fingers over the brick, curling around broken windows and rusted gates. Locals avoided it, especially after dark. Children dared one another to peek through the cracks, but none stayed long. The rumors were simple. The school remembered its students, the ones who had perished in the fire long ago, and it did not like intruders. Ethan, an urban explorer with a camera always slung over his shoulder, didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in photographs and shadows, in stories you could prove. So one November evening, he decided to document the abandoned building. The door groaned when he pushed it open, sending a shiver up his spine. But he was not afraid. Not yet. Inside, the air smelled of smoke long since cooled and of wood rotting silently. Desks sat in neat rows covered in dust and ash, and the blackboard bore the faint chalk outlines of lessons that had been forgotten. As he moved through the hallways, his camera caught glimpses of movement in the periphery. Nothing solid, but enough to make the hair on his arms stand up. Then a faint sound. Laughter. Distant, like children running along the corridors. He paused. The hallways were empty. He stepped closer, and the laughter stopped. The deeper he went, the heavier the air became. Every creak of the floorboards sounded amplified, as if someone were following him. The sound of whispers drifted along the walls. At first, he thought it was the wind, but the voices grew clearer, forming fragments of names, lessons, and admonitions. A room at the end of the hall held the most peculiar sight. A chair rocking slowly, back and forth though no one sat in it. On the desk lay a notebook, open to a page where the ink had dried decades ago. But the words, the handwriting, seemed to shimmer faintly in the lantern light. Ethan felt a cold hand brush against his shoulder. He spun around, nothing. But then the shadows stretched, shifted, and he saw them. Pale children, standing silently in the corners, eyes wide, mouths moving silently in unison. The fire in their hair flickered like candlelight, and for a brief moment, their faces were tragic, longing, and infinitely patient. He tried to speak, but no sound came. They moved closer, each step measured, deliberate. And then, just as quickly, they were gone, the silence heavier than before. Pressing against him like the weight of decades, Ethan left the school at dawn, the photographs safely in his bag. He tried to explain what he saw, but even his own words felt hollow. And yet every night thereafter, he could hear faint laughter in his apartment, soft as the wind, reminding him of lessons unlearned, children never forgotten, and the old boarding school that remembered every voice that had ever passed through its doors. This completes Part 1, Chapters 3 and 4, in full cinematic bedtime style, keeping immersive sensory details, soft reflections, and gentle cliffhangers. On a lonely stretch of road in Colorado, where the pine trees lean close as if to whisper secrets to one another, there exists a place travelers speak of only in hurried tones. It is said that a house appears to those who wander too late or perhaps too tired. Some call it the Phantom House. Others simply say it chooses its guests. Morgan had been driving home from Denver when the fog rolled in thick and fast. The headlights barely cut through it, and she slowed to a crawl. That's when she saw it. A warm glow spilling from the windows, a porch light flickering as if welcoming her in. No house had stood there earlier that day, but there it was, solid and waiting. She parked, heart quickening, drawn toward the inviting light. Every instinct told her to leave, but something held her, a gentle pull, quiet and persistent. The door creaked as she pushed it open. The air inside was impossibly warm, scented faintly of lilacs and pine, as if the house had breathed for years before she arrived. The living room was furnished perfectly, timelessly. Chairs, rugs, a fireplace with embers that glowed, though no fire had been started. Everything was clean, almost lovingly so. Morgan thought she might be dreaming. Yet the feeling of being watched was too real to ignore. As she explored, she noticed the rooms shifted subtly. The hallway seemed longer than it should. The staircase steeper, the kitchen table larger. She passed a mirror and saw herself reflected, but her shadow moved slightly differently, slower, hesitant, almost as if it were observing her rather than mimicking her. Then she heard it. A soft humming carried through the walls. Not one voice, but many, like children whispering together in anticipation. She turned toward the sound and found a staircase leading downward. Though she could not remember seeing it on the floor plan, Curiosity pulled her in. The basement smelled of old wood and lilacs. Boxes lined the walls, and photographs, yellowed and delicate, showed people she didn't recognize. Families, travelers, and faces smiling warmly, yet impossibly familiar. On the floor, a small door had been left slightly ajar. She knelt and peered inside. The room was empty, but the walls pulsed faintly in the lamplight. A voice whispered softly, almost apologetically, "Sit, rest, stay a while." Morgan felt herself compelled to obey. She stepped inside and immediately sensed the house's presence. Not malevolent, not cruel, but alive. It remembered everyone who had ever passed through. Everyone who had slept beneath its roof. Everyone who had wandered too far and found it. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time bent, and the house seemed to fold around her. She tried to leave, but the door had vanished. The windows were gone, replaced by smooth walls that shimmered, faintly with reflections of those who had been here before. Then came the faint sound of footsteps behind her, not one but several approaching slowly. When she turned, no one was visible, yet she could feel them. Their presence, their curiosity, their quiet insistence that she remember the house and all who had stayed within it. When she finally awoke outside, the fog had lifted. Her car sat where she'd left it, but the road was empty. The space where the house had been completely clear. No trace remained, no footprints, no light, nothing. Yet the scent lingered, faint and sweet. Lilacs pressed into her memory. And that night, as she lay in bed, she swore she could hear faint humming beneath the hum of the city. The house calling, remembering, inviting, waiting for the next traveler who might be lost enough to find it. And so the night draws to its gentle close. 10 haunted houses, lighthouses that guard the lost, inns where widows linger, schools echoing with forgotten laughter, and phantom homes that appear only for those who wander too far. They all share one quiet truth. Memory lingers. The past never truly leaves, and some places choose to be remembered. If these stories have carried you through the shadows tonight, let this channel stay beside you. Let it be a soft presence in the dark, guiding you gently into dreams where history, mystery, and the unknown whisper their secrets, and where sleep arrives slowly, softly, and peacefully. As the night folds around you and the world grows quiet, remember, the stories you've heard are not just tales. They are whispers of the past, echoes of lives and places that linger long after the lights go out. Some houses remember, some spirits wait, and some mysteries drift just beyond the reach of sight. So as you close your eyes tonight, let the shadows carry you gently. Let the soft hum of forgotten places cradle your dreams, and know that somewhere, quietly, the light is still burning, us guiding, watching, remembering,